Okay, welcome back. I hope everyone is fed and watered and has recovered from the sight of that robot dog running around downstairs, which left me quite unnerved, I have to say. Time for our science and technology panel for this morning, in which we're going to be looking at what is needed to ensure growth within the ARC and how the sector can attract and retain talent, there's that word again, and what real estate and infrastructure is needed to do that. I'm joined by, starting at the far end, Dr. Andy Williams, Vice President for Cambridge Strategy at AstraZeneca, Dr. Mark Kotter, Chief Executive of Bit.bio, Angus Horner, a last-minute panelist, so thank you, Angus, founder of Hop and Prorus, and Dr. Sally Ann Forsyth, Chief Executive of Stevenage Bioscience Catalyst. And I come with apologies from British Land's David Lockyer, who is under the weather and hasn't been able to make today. Sally Ann, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay, and ask for you to kick off this conversation with your vision for developing place-based strategies for the science and tech industries. Maybe first at that kind of helicopter view, broad level, and then we can dig into what has been done in Stevenage.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for the great question. I think you used the right word there right at the beginning. You start off with the vision. What is your vision of what you're trying to achieve? And then you match that with actually your location constraints and strengths. And I always kind of think of it in three different ways. The first thing I look at is the scientific strength, and that's the academic strength, or it can be commercial research. But it's also, is it something that addresses a global challenge? Is it something that's investable in? And, is it something that we really feel as that location we can take a lead in? So I look at the science first, the strength there. Then I tend to look at the kind of business ecosystem. Where are you on that kind of supply chain of the ideas phase, right the way through to the startups, the translation, the more mature companies, and the manufacturing? So that continuum, where are you? Where are your strengths there? And do you kind of need to backfill to create that innovation pipeline, as I call it? And then the third bit I look at is also the geography. Some areas have natural strengths. Are you an urban centre, or are you out of town? Because that will dictate how you fill in those amenities. Is it easy commutable both for the companies? Are you close to airports and so on, international basis? Or, and also your employees, and for them to have an easy and green commute. And I'd also say housing is really important there in schools. So those are all the considerations, those kind of factors of life. If I translate that now into Stevenage, a fairly new location, Stevenage Bioscience Catalyst. We've been there since 2012. So what have we done in 10 years? Well, if I look at the science there, we've focused right in on cell and gene technology. Global challenge, big margins, very investable. Our companies have raised since 2012 3 billion sterling, 70% of which has been in cell and gene technologies. And we're the third largest cluster in the world and the largest outside of the US. If I look at that's part of the science, then if I look then at the whole kind of supply chain, I say, where are we in the business ecosystem? Well, actually, our focus, we're at the centre of the Golden Triangle, where you've got the academic centres of Cambridge, Oxford, and London. But what we really specialise in is the scale-up area, because we're close to commercialise those innovations coming out of those centres. So we're all about the scale-up with the Catapult Centre, and also with GSK there, we've got an understanding of the commercialization, how to get things out to market. And then lastly, with the location, a newer location, a lower land cost perhaps, that we find that actually manufacturing is really important, we've heard this morning, but really particularly important for cell and gene. So it means that we can have it locally because we have a lower land cost, and also housing for employees. So good travel, good connections, good connectivity, and better housing.
Brilliant. You mentioned clusters. Open to anyone. How do you define that? When does a group of businesses working in close proximity become a cluster? What does that take the relationships between companies to, and what kind of collaboration between different parts of an ecosystem is needed to form what we would look at as a cluster, something that's supporting different levels of business within a certain proximity?
Oh, go on then.
Go on.
I guess you would. I think Cambridge Life Science is defined as a cluster. I think it certainly is a cluster. And I heard the George Freeman quote is it's a safe place to take risks, a safe place to bring your family, because if you lose your job in Cambridge, you can get another job in the life science relatively quickly. So I'll give you some stats on that. You know, the Cambridge cluster is about 500 companies, employs about 15,000 people. From an AstraZeneca perspective, we have 450 to 500 collaborations in the UK as part of many across the globe. About 200 of those 450 collaborations are in Cambridge. About 120 of them with the university. And I'm sure the people from Cambridge in this audience will say that's because Cambridge is particularly excellent. And it is pretty excellent, but it's also partly by the fact that they are close by. So there's an element of building collaborations and trust which helps build a cluster over and above the scientific excellence which exists in any of those areas.
So can I say something to that? I mean, so when I was at Harwell until Stuart and co, good friend over there who's just ripped it out of me for turning up late, took it on. We founded 3 different clusters. One actually was a thing already. So the Harwell Space Cluster had about 5 or 6 organisations. It's now about 105 organisations. I do think that it's reasonable to say that you need a body of people, a density of talent that has some sort of momentum and integrity behind it to make it a real thing. The piece around being able to move job without moving home is a great sort of it's a metric of success. But I think we need to be quite brutal and realistic in the UK, particularly during the next 2 or 3 years where the world's going to be a bit tougher, about those communities and those places that really do have that critical mass and really can be made into a thing. Because there's a number of people who've already referenced today, we should be under no blooming illusion that the world is a red in tooth and claw, incredibly competitive environment. And whilst the cluster mentality and culture needs to be one of it's a team sport, it is not a binary we win, you lose. On an international basis, particularly now with sovereign resilience, we do need to be a bit brutal and honest about ourselves and what we can really do and where we can really have impact and where we can't.
I mean, we are a typical product of a cluster. So Bit.bio is a startup. We've started about 2016, raised 200 million in capital. It's a synthetic biology company that is focused on human cells, creating cell therapies. Our chairman is Hermann Hauser, and you can already see here the connectivity. Chairman, of course, been very fundamental in building this cluster, and we've been able to gain really access to world-class talent. We have a small base in the US as well, and we can see how the density of talent that we have in this area helps tremendously create some very unique opportunities for us. So I think this notion of a critical mass is really important. But it's not only the deep science end that requires critical mass. I think it's also the manufacturing. As we grow from an early stage science company into a company that goes into the clinic and starts thinking about manufacturing, we need to this is another cluster. This is another sort of phenotype that we really need to integrate. I think better in between that golden triangle. So this idea of the arc, I think, really sort of shines a light on having to span these 2 different aspects and in the sort of growth of the company.
What else, Mark, has Bit.bio needed in terms of infrastructure and the environment around it to build and grow?
So our biggest bottleneck is lab space, to be honest. We've been lucky, thankfully, and we're able to move into Babram campus. But again, already think we are sort of reaching in a year or so a stage where we have to look for the next building in terms of, and there's not much on the horizon at the moment.
Can I say something a tiny bit, sort of not hugely controversial, but a tiny bit sort of combative about government? So serious clusters with any real heft take quite a bit of money and quite a lot of time commitment to get going. University of Cambridge, University of Oxford, Harwell. I mean, Harwell is not hundreds of years old, like the great universities, but it is multi-generational. It's sort of 80 years plus in terms of its R&D capabilities, mostly born out of physics. Stevenage has a long heritage as well. These places and these communities of people take decades to actually mature into something that is serious. And it's quite striking to me, having just been asked to come onto this panel, that this session was called, what does the science and technology sector need to grow within the ARC? Now, the ARC is a construct of government. I'm quite happy to say this because I'm co-chairing a task force with the Science Minister, George Freeman, at the moment, looking at these science innovation places and how to make you go faster. But I am under no illusion that clarity and certainty on a long-term basis matters, and government strategy and policy on a long-term basis, rather than just for a year or two, really matters. And I saw Bev Hindle sitting in the audience earlier on. I think he's probably still around somewhere. It won't escape all of your notice that the ARC thing, there is a vote in the leaders group of the ARC on the 24th of June, which is this week. The ARC will either become a regional partnership, big whiz-bang thing, or it won't, this week. And I find it personally, I'm quite happy to say it publicly, reasonably laughable that a serious, long-term, clarity and certainty, strategic project like the ARC can blow in the wind and can come down to a decision inside a few people's kind of fingers and heads later this week. That is a nonsense in terms of how we really make ourselves not just in the vanguard, but a proper winner as a sovereign, resilient, first world, highly technologically advanced country.
And so what pressure does that put on the private sector to carry on that ambition if some element of government support looks to wane, perhaps?
I'm quite ready to answer that. Someone else will probably say something.
So one of the things, of course, is the funding environment, which plays an important role here as well. And we've mainly got US money, quite frankly. So we've outgrown the sort of VC infrastructure in the UK. And I think that's something that needs to be changed. But also, someone mentioned incentives of putting up manufacturing sites. We are receiving inbound sort of opportunities in the US where they basically put up the whole building for us, kit it out for us, and we could just walk in. And inherently, I feel very strongly European, UK-based. My company, we really want to be anchored here. But if we don't do anything, I think this sort of invitation to go overseas is going to be irresistible.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, to add to that, in the UK, life sciences is seen as one of our key elements, one of our key pillars, something we can really take a lead on. And yet, we should be doing a few things well, and not the salami slicing that we're tending to see with government scattering money around. What is it we're going to be number one at? What can we really lead on? Looking at that, and then when I talk to government, it's scattergunning. There's lots of departments, there's BAEs, there's DIT, there's UKTI, there's lots of different groups. There was a thought from William Hague to start saying, should we have a department of science in the UK? And, it's actually coordinating ourselves. As we said this morning, we're one small country. We should be much more coordinated and actually drive, what are we going to do it well, and give that firepower of the skills as well behind it.
One other further thing, and I completely agree with Sally, and it's, that Department of Science has been sort of around for years, and I think we ought to have one that's not just vested inside BAEs. It should be its own independent thing. But there is a further thing that some of us have talked about, including actually at Bidwell's and EG events before, and this is something that we can all do for ourselves inside the knowledge economy, real estate wonderland, which is one of the headwinds. Why does government blow in the wind? It blows in the wind because of national politics. It loses the Amersham by-election, and that's why it suddenly isn't going to change planning legislation and isn't going to build more houses in the ARC. And it was stupid of the government to say the ARC is 1 million homes, because it's not actually. It's much more interesting in terms of the rail infrastructure and the other additive effects of putting people like us in a room together and doing more collaboration. But it blows in the wind politically. We, as a community, could do a much better job at actually explaining that all the things that we're about here are not just about red in tooth and claw, make a few quid out of a few buildings and create a development profit. We are about actually improving the human condition by supporting organisations on the stage with me and in the room. And that effect is additive in terms of the health and lifestyle proposition and the socio-economic prospects of every person in the UK, whether they're in the ARC or they're outside of it. And we don't do a brilliant job of actually explaining that what we are doing is for people as opposed to at or to them. And that is something that I think would help us a lot, because it would make planning easier, both in policy terms, actually tactically. We might get some support for some of the stuff we're doing instead of getting consistently objection for some of the more difficult, regularly big things. That would make a massive difference, because pace, as John Baker said earlier on, we're incredibly slow in the UK. We have to go 10 times faster. Planning is a massive tactical and strategic nightmare, but we could change some of that dynamic by being a bit more expressive.
What would unlock some of those planning constraints as you see them?
One of the things we've done more recently, so clearly working with government and local authorities, but the educational piece that we've been working on, looking at economic impact. So that's not just the investment in the companies, the inward investment, all of those sorts of things, but it's also the jobs, all of that kind of other thing. It's the impact that we have, both economically and socially and health-wise.
Andy, you've made the point that AstraZeneca, of course, operating in many different cities and across many different clusters. With that slightly broader view, how do you look at the development of the ARC, including that idea of government support to boost its position on the world stage?
Let me start the other way around with government. So the position I've always taken with government involvement in the ARC is there are plenty of things we can do without government, but the problem without government, we don't have that democratic mandate. And there's some feeling amongst the citizens that growth somehow impacts negatively quality of life. The biggest challenge we've got at the moment is Cambridge is going so fast from an employment perspective that the quality of life is suffering anyway. So the traffic's really busy, the house price is really high, and so instead of quality of life sort of improving by stopping things, it's going to get worse, and somehow it'll pop, and then quality of life will both decrease and employment opportunities go down because no one will want to live there because they can't afford it and they can't get in because it's too busy. So we do need government involvement because it gives that sort of levelling up, if you like, of everyone gets the opportunity to have their voice, and we'll be better at explaining the things that Angus is frustrated about. I guess in terms of clusters and ARCs, I mean, Cambridge has been a great success for us, so we planned to come to Cambridge in 2015, 2016, bringing 2,000 people in. That was my role, 2,000 people in Cambridge. We've got 4,500 people in Cambridge. So there's an example of the topsy-turvy growth, if you like. Place-based strategies, we knew when we came to Cambridge that if we just came in and sucked it dry and took up all the skills and the talent, that would destroy the cluster that we had. So we made a point of not doing that. But we're now in the position we've got 4,500 people in Cambridge, which is a city of 120,000. There is not really much of an opportunity to grow in Cambridge unless Cambridge either expands very quickly or becomes part of a wider connection, if you like. So that's problematic for us. We look at either and you go to Oxford or Cambridge or perhaps in the future Stevenage, you could see lights of global innovation, lights of great global stuff. But each of those places does not have the critical mass in itself to be a true superpower. So Cambridge, 120,000, metropolitan area of Boston, 5 times as big. Go out to wider, greater Cambridge, that's about 400,000, greater Boston, 5 million. If you look at it from a global pharmaceutical industry perspective, we do not have the critical mass in either Oxford or Cambridge or Stevenage unless we can join them up. And it doesn't have to be physical infrastructure. That would help. Digital infrastructure, business connectivity, ARC University Group, all those things we can do ourselves. But like I say, without that government layer on top, it looks self-serving. And we need to find a way of engaging government in the future so it's widely understood by the existing communities and the communities that come forward in the future.
We've got hurrah, we've got a question on Slido here. I'm excited about this. From Mark Charlton at Didobi. Thank you, Mark. I mean that genuinely. Is the lack of the right type of commercial space in Cambridge, Oxford and London holding back the expansion of life science companies and forcing them to consider other UK regions? Who'd like to tackle that?
I'll just add to my point that I don't agree we can't be expanding. I don't think you're saying it. We've got 450 collaborations across the UK. There is world-class science happening across the UK. 4,500 jobs in Cambridge, supporting 45,000 jobs across the UK. It's not an either-or scenario. There's world-class science elsewhere in the UK. We need to do a better job of joining up the high cluster manufacturing in the northwest of England to the ARC, which East West Rail would do through the West Coast Main Line. So it's not an either-or. We can support both. But if those 4,500 jobs aren't in Cambridge, they ain't going to the regions.
Yeah, and to be clear, I mean, you're right. I mean, I wasn't suggesting that on a regional basis, we need to kind of say, these are the winners, these are the losers. But to Sally Ann's point, I mean, it's very clear the life sciences strategy of sort of 7 years ago now, I think, 3 main areas. John Bell says, and that strategy said it was going to be early disease detection, genomics, and data and analytics. We have to win thematically in particular areas, as per the discussion earlier on. And I also think that whilst regionally one needs to be clear, there are pockets of excellence everywhere. We nationally need to be a bit clear about where we're really going to shoot the lights out and get 10 out of 10 versus 6 out of 10.
But back to your question, does the lack of commercial space hinder startups' growth? And I think so, yes. I mean, it's at the moment, what's the amount of free space in Cambridge is about 1%, isn't it? So essentially, you have to network yourself into into the sort of real estate world before the building is built in order to have enough space to have it. I mean, we're reaching a stage where we now will be able to commission our own buildings, but I think it's this shouldn't be a problem, to be honest. I think we should have sufficient space in order to allow many other startups to grow.
Yeah, and what's fantastic about an event like this, I mean, it validates the point that we've moved through the gears, even just during the last sort of 5 or 6 years inside the real estate community, such that this sector is now attracting a whole load of attention because it's making good returns. And actually, you naturally get the market effect of people pile in and there's more provision. And I think some of these markets will catch up and actually get to the point where there may even be a bit of a surfeit in places. But there is a cultural change which has been affected in a number of places already, like Harwell, like Oxford Science Park, like I'm sure Cambridge Science Park, whereby if you have main asset investment managers that control a lot of space, they are quite content with churn and they are quite content to actually tear leases up. It doesn't matter if you sign a 10-year lease. My colleague and I over there, we regularly tore up leases that were 10 years. We tore up three leases for one organisation. All of them were 10 years long. We tore 3 of them up in 36 months. Because, you want that company to grow and you're quite happy.
Well, this is an interesting point because another Slido question that's come in. Mark Charlton kicked the door open and now they're unstoppable. Suzanne Gill asks, do traditional UK leases help science and tech companies plan for growth through uncertainty, or do they fetter it by tying them to inappropriate terms? But from what you say there, Angus, if it felt like they were going to fetter them.
I think the mentality of it's a terrible feudal term, and we always talked about occupiers rather than tenants, and we hated calling ourselves landlords because that was a nonsense, not from flipping dark ages. I think that FRI long-term leases, could they be improved? Yes. The key thing, though, is being an owner that is prepared to throw stuff in the bin and actually reinvent it and go with what the occupier needs. That is a cultural mentality, and we're getting much better at it.
Yeah, and kind of in some ways, sad to say, I've been in this industry quite a long time, and I have seen a big change from originally it was kind of the old-fashioned leases and so on, and they really did constrain our businesses. But it's a little bit like we were saying earlier, that investors have become more savvy and understand the technologies better, which means they're more likely to invest, and they see how to address the risks. And it's been the same with the property industry. We've seen people move from tenants to occupiers and even customers.
Yeah.
And understanding that industry, and again, that's part of our education to government and to the property industry, is what are the constraints, but what is the joy of if you get the circumstances right for these parks, they absolutely take off. But right now, there is a shortage. We're seeing the types of accommodation change from the lab, office, but now manufacturing, and then flexibility is key. Can you move between these very easily, cheaply, and so on? So we're seeing that investment coming in differently, and hopefully that will continue in the future. But there's a catch-up going on right now, and when we've caught up, what will happen then? It'll be interesting to see the next evolution, because prices are going so high at the moment that we're getting to the commercial limits in some ways.
And that is a massive topic area. I mean, we haven't talked about it at all today, but the pricing thing is, I don't know which session you're going to touch on it, but that is a real issue now. It's a real issue in terms of whether people have overpaid or not, and it's a huge issue in terms of those organisations that are occupying space, whether they're going to then suffer the backlash of actually owners trying to dig themselves out of a hole that they've made themselves by overpaying for stuff.
Do you sense that people have started to overpay
definitely
for this space?
I'm not going to name names, but some of the stuff that we've seen transacted the last 18 months, we haven't quite been rolling around on the floor laughing, but there've been some numbers paid where you go, bloody hell. How are you going to make money out of this rather than spend money? And you can't just inflate rents on your cash flow forecast in perpetuity. At some point, they're going to be unaffordable.
I suppose my concern is that for these campuses in particular, it's all about the added value and bringing that community together and all the support. If the prices go too high, then those added value pieces aren't always commercially as attractive. So if you've got to get your money back on your investment, you're going to focus in on the commercial high return buildings and less so on the amenities and so on. And that takes the quality out of the whole added value community piece.
Mark, I wanted to skip back to something you touched on earlier and get a little more insight into it. You were speaking about your desire for the UK funding market to be rethought, revamped. And you said most of the money in the company is now US. Is there any,
Yes.
Is there any UK money in, or a very small amount?
There's, I think, a pre-seed angel round that was UK-based, and everything else was really European and then international, mainly US-based.
So what would you like to see change in the UK market that might have, in a different world, have seen a greater proportion of UK capital invested in the business?
I think the first thing that strikes me is the mentality here needs to sort of embrace biotech as not so risky as it actually is. I mean, we see the London Stock Exchange and all the things that are happening there. There are whales operating there, and money essentially evaporates. Somehow that risk-taking doesn't enter these early-stage companies. And in fact, actually, you would say, when you invest in life sciences, you always get a return. It's whether the company flies or not is one question, but you create knowledge, you create people that have skills, and so I think it's a sector that is worthy of investment generally. And I think then in terms of when you look at the technical details why this is happening, I think the ministers are aware. They're looking at changing some of the regulations around pension funds. We need to build a cadre of analysts on the London Stock Exchange, because of course at the moment we're looking towards the Nasdaq or the sort of New York Stock Exchange, because the analysts out there that can sort of help the investors and the consumer investors to decide where to deploy their money. And then there is other bits as well. I think the government again is addressing things by creating vehicles that anchor companies in the UK. But we also see the VC scene going through a learning path, so to speak, similar to what happened maybe 15 years ago in the US, where everyone was sort of putting up their arms. The startups are getting too expensive, the rounds are getting too big. But hey, if you want to create companies that scale, you have to, unbox that, and you have to create, larger ticket sizes. Otherwise, you end up where we are at this point, where most of the companies are being sold. I mean, we have some great companies that remained in the UK and are growing, like Oxford Nanopore more recently. But I do think the aim should be to have many more of these companies, and not the flips and the quick exits. Also in the cell and gene therapy space, where this is quite unique. If you look at the size of the UK and what's actually happening here in the stem cells field, I think we're pretty leading at this point in time. But the question is, what's the fate going to be of these companies and technologies?
We have a little bit of a problem with the kind of patient capital, as they say. We'll sit there and wait. Because the companies go through several rounds, and at each round they're trying to get the next lot of money so they get their results, and they go, because they're not profit making, they rely on this funding coming in. And of course, at each round there's always an opportunity to drop out or for them to sell up. And we're seeing a lot of companies sell up, they don't get there. Whereas in the cell and gene, we've got some other companies such as Syncona that are long-term investors, and investors in the UK. So they're going right up that supply chain rather than just going up to the large-scale company. They're including the manufacturing. And we're actually seeing that trend coming through, that these the investors are staying for longer and actually going further down the supply chain, which is a great thing for the UK and keeps them here.
I'm a great believer in we are getting a lot better at this. I mean, you're talking about leases earlier on, 25-year lease. You know, you could argue the venture capital industry has only been an industry for about 40 years. The private equity market, private equity sort of funding regime's only been around for about sort of 20 years-ish. You know, we are getting a lot better at it. Chaz referenced earlier on this morning the Oxford Science Innovation Now Enterprise guys. You know, the weight of capital is a completely different order of magnitude to what it used to be. They are quite clear that inside their existing portfolio companies, they have a need of about 4 or 5 billion to carry on financing for the next few years, just in their existing portfolio, setting aside what they will need for the next portfolio companies, and they will get the money. And that is a total inflection point and a massive shift in terms of the weight of money chasing these things down and their propensity, as Sonia and colleagues say up here, to actually be a bit longer term and actually stay in, because you know we haven't quite caught up yet with the US mentality of value growth. Growth itself is actually more important a lot of the time than declaring a dividend because you've actually got some profit. You know, that is a bit of a shift that we need to get better at. But I think we are getting there. It is changing.
Yeah. Time for maybe just one or two questions from the floor. If it encourages anyone, Angus did say that he was going to try to swear and then blame David at British Land. So if anyone can give him an opportunity to do that, I'm sure he'd be grateful. Anyone with a burning question they'd like to put to the panel? Yes, just there.
Andrew Ross from Global Garden. The elephant not in the room here is Michael Gove and Levelling Up and the Regeneration Bill. How do you want to advise the Secretary of State that he should be taking a priority investment in the Oxford to Cambridge arc?
So I think I already hinted at it. We have 4,500 roles in Cambridge, and either directly or indirectly, they're supporting another 45,000 roles across the UK. It's not a zero-sum game. Reducing investment in things that you're very good at, which is your point, Angus, is not the way to ensure that you get very good elsewhere. It's by working across the piece and ensuring that the opportunities that come through the arc play out in the rest of the country, rather than the rest of the country trying to develop world-class expertise in something which takes 10, 20, or in Cambridge's case, 800 years.
Can I bolster that by saying, I mean, at Harwell, on my colleague's watch, we secured about another 800 million of CapEx for R&D infrastructures in about 3 years. That's just one location in South Oxfordshire. You know, you add Cullen, which just had another 220 and had various bits of money for that before, and then you add various other bits of university. And I mean, you know, these are massive amounts of money, and it's quite right that actually those sorts of that scale of investment in hard research infrastructure should be spread more generously into advanced research and advanced manufacturing in other bits of the UK. What I think would make a huge difference for the ARC area and continuing to win for the whole of the country would actually be for Michael Gove to reinvent the bloody planning regime. You know, I mean, the 1947 Town Country Planning Act, I mean, it hasn't really been properly reinvented since then, and it's a bloody joke. You know, this is a multi-departmental gig. So the thing that I'm doing, I've already said to government, you know, we are going to write a paper. I've already basically written it, but we're going to validate it with some evidence from various people, some of whom might be in the room, to sort of help government understand, you know, the reality of the world. And then we want to do a multi-departmental sort of gig on, let's go to some places with DIT, with DLUC, as it's now called, and BAYS, and Department of Education, and the Department of Transport, because you can't fix anything unless you have a multi-departmental approach. And if Gove gave us, through his department, more clarity and certainty, more long-term policy position, and an ability to do things at serious pace, that would make a huge difference. And that doesn't cost a ton of cash. That is not about having 500 million for the next thing. That's actually just about giving people the ability to go and do something quickly.
I want to add something as well. So I think the biggest drivers for new opportunity and jobs across the UK will be building big companies. And you've seen this, for example, when BioNTech moved from a stage company like ours to now a fully integrated pharma business. And suddenly they put up, manufacturing sites all over Europe and Germany. Research institutes are popping up, et cetera, et cetera. You cannot do this remotely. You have to be, you create the center of a company has to be in the center of a cluster, because that's where it can grow. But once we are able to sort of reach that, inflection point, then it spreads across the entire company, because the cluster, as you already said, won't be able to hold the requirements of that company. So I think you cannot build big companies outside of a cluster, but once you have them, they will spread like wildfire.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We're just out of time. Another quick 5-minute break, if you can bear with us while we prepare our next speakers. But for now, a big thank you to the panelists for that session.